And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris to all of you, and I look forward to just learning and growing myself. So, Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Pete. Hello, everybody. So I'll just do a very brief background, but I'm going to open up my screen here. All right. So my background in gardening, etc., is actually not a formal one. I didn't actually receive any education other than through Cornell Cooperative Extension. It was just driven by a very big passion that I had that stemmed from my grandfather, really. So most summers as a kid, I was, watched by my grandparents, like probably many kids were when their parents were out working. And my grandfather was a huge gardener. After the war, he worked for Yonkers doing, basically their plants throughout the city. So at home, of course, he had a massive garden, which we enjoyed, cucumbers, tomatoes, every kid whose grandparent probably, remembers going out and grabbing something out of there or, just putting salt on a tomato and just biting into it. So that was basically my childhood, which kind of exposed me to gardening. And it wasn't something I really truly appreciated at the time, but as I got older, I realized how important it was to my own life and how, like, some people find a certain passion in life that kind of drives them through the rest of their life. And this was definitely it for me. So this ended up being something that happened in my own household. We would start a garden there, and then eventually we had issues with things growing. So of course I wanted to check out what's going on. So I started researching. So turns out, um, you know, you need to add fertilizer to the soil. You can't just keep growing into it repeatedly, or you have to do something to feed the soil and to give nutrients back to it. So that ultimately ended up me going down a rabbit hole where I kind of just never came out. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know how everything was connected. So this is basically just been years and years of intensive research, and looking at the right places, connecting with the right people, and you can get all the information you need. Not necessarily something that has to be done through a formal education. So let's get started.
Chris, as we get started, do you want to talk about how you want to field questions and kind of
Yeah,
speak to that briefly?
yeah. So um, we will be, I'll go through a few slides, and obviously this is a lot of information to go through, especially for beginners. So we will be taking questions during, but we also have, if you notice at the bottom of your screen, there will be a chat feature, which you could type in questions, which Pete will be looking through, and occasionally we'll stop to answer some questions because I'm pretty much going to do a beginner's run through gardening. So obviously everyone's got different levels of experience, but for the sake of covering everybody, we'll start with the beginner stuff. And if anyone has questions and wants to dive in deeper on a topic, then I'll elaborate more. I'll do a little shout out to Ed Iliano. I don't know if anyone knows Ed. He has been a master gardener for a long time, and he's the huge vegetable guy there. So a lot of the slides in this he did, and I kind of put in some of my own information too. Okay, so to start out, there's obviously different approaches to gardening, and you'll find out over time that there's no right way to do anything really. I mean, it's open to experimentation and kind of what works best for you. So one approach which has gained a lot of interest, thankfully, is the organic or sustainable approach, or if you wanted to go even further, regenerative, which is like a very intense, very mindful way of growing, and you're not only preserving the space, you're actually enhancing it over time. Intensive gardening will be something we go into. It's just a method of gardening which kind of gets the most out of your space. Then there's raised bed versus in ground. Not everybody has an open space to grow into, so sometimes raised beds are a good way to grow, and containers are even better. If you've just got deck space or a small patch that you really can't grow into the ground directly. What is organic growing? So depending on what kind of a grower you are, if you're a farmer selling vegetables or if you're just a home gardener, there's a little bit of a different definition of that. So no synthetic fertilizers to start. So synthetic fertilizers are giving nutrients directly to the plant. There's no need for microbes in the soil to break anything down. It's ready to go for the plant. And they're usually in very high quantities, the nutrients. They're, like 20. It's way more than the plant actually needs. And because the microbes in the soil don't need to do anything to it, it's basically just, it can also pass through the soil very quickly. So nutrient management is trying to prevent leaching or erosion, to basically not lose all those excess nutrients into the water system or other things that can be harmful to us in the end. No prohibited pesticides. There are organic options, but not to say that organic options cannot be harmful, because if they can, like anything in the wild, pretty much there's a lot of these are derived from natural, compounds. So you still need to be very careful with using them. Promoting a healthy soil. So in organic gardening, you're feeding the soil. You're not actually feeding the plant directly. What's happening is the microbes in the soil are breaking down those organic fertilizers, organic matter, and turning it into food for the plants. So the approach of not necessarily dumping a liquid synthetic, but more so like, how can you get the microbe population in the soil to build up so much that they're able to readily feed your plants when they break down that organic matter. And I just popped in organic seeds. So not necessary unless you're an organic grower selling food, like an organic farm. There is actually a rule that you have to use organic seeds. There is a lot of controversy behind whether or not that's necessary, just because if you raise a plant from seed organically, is it still considered organic? And in my mind, yes, everyone's free to have their own thoughts and opinions on it, and garden your own way. But when it comes to gardening organically, it's nice to support organic seed vendors. So buying organic seeds is definitely a good way to do that. But it's also not necessarily 100%. It's not required as a home gardener. Just a few points on being sustainable. So obviously we all create, a lot of food waste, and it's very difficult sometimes to do anything, about it really, if you don't have the space. But making your own compost, or using even something like a worm bin, which I have, which sometimes freaks people out a little bit, when you have a bunch of worms in a bin in the corner of your house. But I assure you that nothing gets out. But it's a great way to even take some of your waste and just kind of let the worms break it down, and you're getting good stuff in the end, because their castings are a great amendment to soils, to adding to your plants. There's just nothing, I can't say enough about composting. It's not only good for you and your plants, saves you money, but it's also great for reducing food waste. Saving seed, a great way to kind of capture a plant that does well in your environment, and being able to preserve that by saving seed from it is very beneficial to you, but it also is a way to reduce your costs. So I'll talk a little bit as to what can be saved, or best methods for seed saving a little bit. And cover crops. Cover crops are a way to enhance the soil, protect the soil. It's kind of like using fertilizers, but in the most organic way. You're actually growing the fertilizer, and truthfully, that's what you really are doing. Okay, so the reason why I'm going to talk a little bit about what open pollinated versus hybrid are is because if you do ever want to save seed, there's things to know beforehand, and that's OP, which what you'll typically see on a packet. If it doesn't outright say open pollinated, OP is the shortcut for that. That means that you can save the seed because that seed will grow true to the parent plant. And the asterisk I put there is to be mindful because there are certain plants that are more susceptible to cross-pollination, and some almost never get cross-pollinated, so it's very easy to save. I'll give you a perfect example. Beans and peas, they pretty much already self-pollinate before the flower even opens, so you usually don't have much of an issue with the seed being contaminated by another plant that's nearby of the same species. So just look out for open pollinated to start when saving seed. The reason why hybrid's not good for saving seed is if you're trying to preserve the variety that you grew that year. A hybrid seed is a cross with another plant, and there's many generations of crosses. So you may get, if you grow the seed out from that plant, you may end up getting one of the crosses of one of the different generations that looks nothing, tastes nothing like the original plant. So just watch out for hybrids. An heirloom is really just another name for an open pollinated variety, but it's been preserved over generations. So it's a very old variety, tend to be very flavorful.
Oh, they're true.
And they also usually have a different variety of colors, like purple and yellow and stuff. Carrots, you'll see a lot of different colored carrots out there. The only one point I will say is don't be confused by when I say saving seed. So if you grow a hybrid seed, actually, obviously the seed you're growing from that packet will be what is shown on the packet. It's only the seed saved from the plant that you first grew that can be affected on the next grow. So the first seed, don't worry about.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
So I think you're answering the question now. So Gabriel's has a few questions, and one of them is around tips. Are there tips that you'll provide to help people start plants from seed? So you're going to move into that, I think, pretty soon.
Sure. Yeah, we'll get to the point of different methods of planting, whether or not it's starting from seed or starting from transplant.
Great.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Yep. Soil prep. So there's obviously, if you've got a lawn and you're just starting out, you're going to want to get rid of those grass roots and kind of get to bare ground before you start planting vegetables or herbs into it. So you can turn your grass into a garden by either literally turning the grass. It can be a little bit of a cumbersome method to turn. So one of the things I like to do, which I mentioned here, is tarping, where you actually lay a tarp over the grow space, secure it down with rocks, whatever, and basically you're killing the soil, killing the grass, so that you don't have to deal with mass amounts of roots, etc. There's tilling and turning. So a reason why I put tilling asterisk next to tilling is because, well, we don't really recommend you till, but if you're just starting out, tilling could be kind of necessary just to get the ground workable to start. So that's one of the things that I'll say that you could start out with, but I don't recommend using that method each year when you already have an established garden. Double digging, there's a diagram up to the top right. That's kind of when you remove a first cut section of where you're going to grow, you put it to the side, and then you add each section that you take out over one section until you eventually shift everything over, and then the last one goes in the end again. I've actually never even tried doing it before. I know some people do it, but it's just another method if you wanted to. Lasagna layering, this diagram here in the center. Great way to start your garden out and then be ready for growing, because you're adding organic matter. So there's, the very bottom layer shows cardboard, which is a good way to kind of smother the grass. And then there's subsequent layers of either grass clippings, brown material like leaves, compost, and then you're just layering it up to the end where you get to about, leaves, I think, kind of top it off. And that'll take time to break down. So this is not something I would recommend doing in the spring, because if you want to start in the spring, it'll take time for that all to break down and it might not be ready in time. So this is something I'd say to do in the early fall, if you want to use this method, or if you're eager to start growing. I'd say this season, it might take a little longer for you to get directly to spring planting if you started this method now. So just timing your method so that you can match up the time you want to grow with. Intensive gardening. This is a great way to, especially if you have a small space, because, I find even if I don't have a small space, that my space is always too small. So when you really start getting into gardening and loving what you see and wanting to try all different new things, there's just never enough space. So you try to use your space as best you can. And so intensive gardening is a good way to do that, because you're growing more in the space than you normally would according to the seed packet, which I'll go into later. The seed packet's not the be all. It's not something that you have to follow to a T. But the good thing about growing intensively is that because you're not exposing too much soil surface to the sun, you're conserving water. You're not allowing evaporation to occur. So this is a great way to kind of reduce the amount of water you need. It does take up more nutrients as a result because you're growing more in a smaller space. But it's a very, very good way to grow in small spaces. I do this method all the time. These are carrots here. And this is actually when they're very young still. Once this filled in, you couldn't even see the bed anymore. It was just, and the carrots were growing right on top of each other. I thinned them out a little along the way so I can get decent sized roots. But again, it's one of those things where, you can kind of experiment with, you don't have to have them at this spacing necessarily. There are some vegetables you want to give space, but carrots and others are not one of them. Container gardening. Okay, so every vegetable that you can grow in the ground, you can grow in a container. You could even grow trees in containers. The only thing you have to remember is the size of the container definitely does matter when it comes to certain plants. So in the front here on the smaller containers, you'll see some peppers, and then there's eggplant. These are only like 5 to 7 gallon containers. And for some reason in the horticulture world, 5 gallon is not true 5 gallon. Just like in the lumber industry, it's never really true 2x4, right? It's like 1.5 by 3.5. You'll have to see what the measurements are when you buy them. But when I say a 7 gallon container, it probably could be closer to 5 gallons. So a 5 gallon true container is definitely enough to grow peppers in, or eggplant if you have those. Just remember that if you have a container like a 5 gallon container that's not meant specifically for growing, you will have to drill holes in it. So just remember that, because drainage is very important. Growing media, you're not using real soil in containers. And the reason why is because real soil can either A, be contaminated, B, it compacts very easily, and it basically, because your containers dry out so much faster, you'll be in a very tough situation when it comes time to watering, because when everything compacts, water cannot infiltrate into where the roots are. So it kind of beads around the side, and it becomes difficult for your plant to get water. So growing medium, you'll see potting soil out there. do not be confused by garden soil. The bags sometimes are very confusing when they're labeled. So make sure you're using something meant for pots, and they usually have a peat moss base. They've got either vermiculite or perlite, something that regulates the moisture in the soil, and something that also kind of puts more sizable, like the perlite will basically more porous so that water can drain through properly as well. But just be careful, because even with peat moss, if you let the plant dry out too much, the soil, it can be hydrophobic on the top. So you want to give it a good soak and then soak it again. And then just to make sure that the water infiltrates and doesn't just go around the sides. Fertilizing. Your plants in a container cannot get access to nutrients like a plant in the ground could. They could stretch their roots out as far as they need to reach for water, to reach for nutrients. In the pot, they just have the pot. So making sure that they get the proper nutrients is important. So thinking about liquid fertilizers, there's great organic options out there. Neptune's Harvest is a great company with liquid fertilizers. I start them usually at flowering. So if you have a fruiting plant, right at flowering is when they need another good kick of nutrients. So at that point, I don't expect that the medium I started with has enough nutrients to really let the plant produce to its full capacity. So I like to add once every 10 days, incorporate liquid fertilizer into the watering. And just remember that watering habits on a hot sunny day in a black pot like that right there, you may have to water in the morning and in the afternoon. So just be mindful that a plant in the ground versus a plant in a pot, the watering habits are night and day. You could water a plant in the ground once a week. You could water a plant in a pot 14 times a week. It's not to dissuade you from growing in a pot, because I do it because I need the space. Sometimes that's where the best sunlight is. But just be mindful that if you want the best results, you just have to cater to the different methods.
Hey Chris,
Yeah.
when I'm doing intensive gardening, would you also recommend liquid fertilizer for that as well, just to make sure that all those plants you're able to give them enough nutrition?
Sure. I actually, yes, I do use that sometimes as well. I will do it less frequently for plants in the ground, especially if I know the soil has a good amount of either compost or it's enriched. It's not as frequent with in-ground, but yes, you can use it for in-ground. And I would also recommend at flowering as well, like a tomato plant, pepper plant. As soon as flowering starts, they need another boost. So yes, you can put it in the ground as well. Just a couple more benefits. It's a controllable environment, right? You can move it wherever you want. The weeds are not an issue usually, because it's a sterile mix of no seed with no real soil in it. So there's no weed seeds typically, nothing like that. And then when you're done, you could stack your pots up at the end of the season and put them away. So that's very easy. Plus you can keep them out of reach of pests. And the growth will get faster because it will heat up faster than the ground. Just a few little key words. If you're looking on the back of a packet, if you ever see a variety that mentions being a patio, a bush, or a dwarf, those work best in containers. Those you'll get the best results with in containers. It's not to say that that's the only ones you can use in containers. I grow plants I'm not supposed to grow in containers all the time. Just be mindful, like I said, if you're doing something big, bigger pot, smaller pot. I use 10 to 15 gallon pots, horticulture gallons, for my tomatoes typically.
Could you also address growing in a raised ground?
Raised bed.
Raised
Yes.
bed, yeah.
Yep. I will mention, actually, I think that's coming up soon, about growing in raised gardens. Not only contained ones, but ones that are basically just mounded raised gardens.
Thank you.
So just some of the similarities, which I pretty much touched on already. You can grow both ways. The growing season's the same. Light requirements are going to be the same. And the differences are just watering, fertilizing, and the type of medium you use. There you go, raised beds. So these are some elaborate raised beds. They do not have to be this elaborate. They can simply be 4 pieces of wood screwed together, and then you just put soil in it, or you bury it enough so that it's just, there's no bottoms typically on the raised beds that you'll see on the top images. The one on the bottom would actually technically be considered a container because it's not in contact with the soil. There's a bottom on it. So for something like that, even though it's large, I think that's 4 or 3 by 6, that size on the bottom, you'd still want to use potting soil. So just keep in mind that if it's got a bottom on it, try to think of using potting soil instead. Consider that a container. The ones on the top both have no bottoms. They're directly in contact with the soil. So while they're pretty tall, they may not reach the native soil much. They're still, if they had to, they could reach below what's in the container and get nutrients if they needed to. The drainage is way better. It's kind of just like being in a container because you're adding very loose soil. You're typically adding a mix of half compost, half topsoil, which is going to be a great combination for the plants to grow in. Obviously, if it's further off the ground, that's less you getting down on your knees or, having to crawl through or whatever. So it's definitely helpful when it's raised off the ground. As a result, because it's not in the ground, it's off the ground, the sun is going to warm it up faster. And then also, while it won't keep deer out, the ones up top, it will definitely keep, smaller things that can't jump that high out, depending on the height of the bed. They are a little pricey. The lumber, obviously, over time doesn't last forever. And it's, it's not a major cost if you're keeping it to something like pine. And if your beds are not too elaborate like the ones up top, it doesn't necessarily take too much wood to rebuild. So while cedar is probably double the price of pine, cedar can last a good 8 to 10 years. And obviously the thickness of the wood matters too. So if I were to use pine, I'd use 2 by pine. So that's the thickness of 2 inches versus 1 by. And 2 by also is less likely to warp. It's much more sturdy to deal with as well. I mentioned at the bottom, no wider than 4 feet. The reason why is because when you're growing, whether it be in the ground or in a pot, anything, you don't ever want to push down the soil or compact it. So in a raised bed, don't go any wider than 4 feet, because if you do, you're going to either be on your tippy toes, leaning in, trying to grab something out just to avoid stepping on the soil, or you're going to have to end up stepping into the soil, which is going to cause compaction, and you don't want to deal with compaction. So just be mindful that the width matters a lot. And then I mentioned screws are better than nails. I know it's probably old school to use nails these days, but screws are definitely a longer lasting and much sturdier option.
If you were to use pine instead of cedar, how long might that last?
Depending on the thickness of pine, I use 2 by pine, and I'd say you're going to get a good 5 years out of it. 1 by, I don't use any 1 by wood, so I'm not too sure. I would say maybe closer to 3, but it would also depend on the environment it's sitting in. If it doesn't get a lot of sunlight, if it's constantly wet, it could, rot faster. And I think I did mention back there, yes, use untreated pine. So some people used, pressure treated, which when I first started out way back, I didn't think anything of it. It's not to say that if you already have pressure treated that you're going to get sick from doing it. It's just frowned upon to use untreated. I highly recommend using an alternative if you can. And I wish we had redwood, but unfortunately we don't live out west. So the price of that would be probably absurd to grow here, to use here. But yes, something like cedar is naturally rot resistant. So it's got benefits, even though it's pricier.
And Chris, the reason you would not use pressure treated wood is because of the heavy metals in it, I assume?
Yeah, I think they removed, I think they used to use arsenic, but I think that was outlawed in 2004. And now they use like a copper chromate. Yes, but the heavy metals are what you're concerned about. It would be much more of an issue, I believe, if you had very acidic soil. There's certain acidity, certain pH levels where those heavy metals can be absorbed more readily by the plants. So that it's just one of those things where if you can avoid it, I would, because you don't want to have to worry about it or think about it.
Thanks.
This is important. What is our hardiness zone? So we're in 6A, 6B. If you're closer to the south, you're probably closer to 6B, or southern Putnam. May 15th is the average. Now keep in mind when I say average, because we've gotten frosts the 3rd, 4th week in May before in the past. It's not impossible to happen. So when you see seed packets, and I'm going to show you an example of descriptions on a website, you'll see a lot of times it mentions weeks or days before or after frost. And that's important to know, because you want to know that if you're starting a plant, especially if you're starting one indoors, that you're going to time it around the time it needs to be outside with the time that is after a frost. If it's a sensitive plant like a tomato, eggplant, pepper. So knowing when the frost dates are on average is good to know. And for me, with something like a heat-loving plant like peppers and tomatoes, peppers and eggplant, I even go a couple weeks after last frost. And you'll even see that instructed sometimes 2 weeks after last frost. So like Memorial Day weekend is a very big weekend for me when it comes to planting tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. But I always keep an eye on the weather because you never know. So it's really just a game of preparing, but prepare for a delay as well, just in case the weather, and we all know the weather has been really weird the last few years. So just got to keep attention to that. All right, some planning. Choosing a site. So if you're going to grow on the ground, or even if you're going to grow in pots, you want plenty of sunlight, or as much as you can get. Now I say you need 6+ hours of uninterrupted sunlight. And I'm putting the asterisk there is because that is not required for every single vegetable, every single herb, every single flower out there. If you want to grow a lot of the fruiting vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, watermelons, all the heat-loving stuff, they will need closer to 8+ hours of uninterrupted sunlight. If you're growing leafy greens, root vegetables, they'll be probably closer to the 5-hour mark. Leafy greens could probably get away with even less than that. So just bear in mind, if it's a fruiting vegetable, you want more sun. If it's a leafy vegetable or something that's not a fruit, then you can work with less sunlight. Where's your water source? I carried 2 3-gallon watering cans, probably about 10 times a day at one point. And I can tell you right now, if you can grow near your hose, please do, because unless you want a really good workout, it's a pain to carry watering cans constantly, especially if it's been hot out and all your plants need to get watered. So just keep in mind where your water source is. If the closer you can get to it, the better. What type of soil do you have? Do you notice that the ground in the area you're looking to grow cracks all the time? That could mean that you have a heavy clay soil there, which means the water is not going to penetrate through it. So there's very good ways. In fact, the Cornell Cooperative Extension will do a soil test for you. They will do a test of the pH, and they can do a structure test. So they'll do that ribbon test where they can tell you if it's a clay loam, sandy, I recommend, if you're not sure visually by looking at it, if it's okay, to reach out to the Cooperative Extension. They'll be happy to answer those questions for you and take a sample of your soil. As I said, mentioning drainage, you don't want any areas where water just sits for a day after it rains. You want to make sure that it's draining pretty frequently when it rains heavily. And this may be difficult, but of course, if you can avoid areas where the animals can get, who can? I mean, it's just one of those things you kind of have to prepare for, that they will come. They may not have been there before, but when you grow their favorite food, they will start coming. And if, you know, sometimes on the deck, like I said, if you have pots and you're growing on the deck and they won't go on your deck, win-win right there. This is just an example of a soil analysis. Now, this is not from Cornell Cooperative Extension. The Cooperative Extension can't do an analysis like this. This has got to be sent to a lab. Cornell does have a soil lab, and they will do a test. There's other ones out there. This is just giving you a brief profile of what's in the soil. So the big ones, NPK, you'll notice the N not there because nitrogen is too volatile to actually test, so they don't test for nitrogen. Phosphorus, you can see phosphorus is through the roof. That's the P. That is because phosphorus, I can't say phosphorus. Phosphorus does not move readily through the soil. It's very difficult to get out. So you'll notice the numbers get up a lot. And phosphorus, especially, even though it can't leach very easily, depending on the form it's in, if there's erosion, that is how phosphorus can move. And that's when it can get into the water systems and cause issues. So more likely than not, you do not need phosphorus for a while. So just knowing what you have to work with and knowing what you need to add as a result is always a good thing. You don't want to jack up the levels in your soil if you don't need to. Just other things to think about, you know, what kind of time do you have to do? I would spend every single day, every hour of my life doing this. I don't mind if it's me going in, I'm always in the garden, probably 3 times a day I'm in the garden. It's just what budget your time. So what you're willing to give to the garden, just try to make sure that you can keep up with the needs of the garden. So trying to manage your expectations and what you're willing to do so that things don't get out of hand and you become overwhelmed. So it's always good to start even on the small side in that case. If you're a new grower, get that, you know, satisfaction of growing something like a green bean or something that grows fast and is not necessarily high maintenance, and experience what gardening is like before you get hit with, I have to weed every week. What do you mean? So
Every day.
it's just, or every day. Did someone say every day? So it's just one of those things you want to think about. What do you like to eat? Some people say, you know, don't ever grow something if you're not going to eat it. And I always say to them, well, if I'm growing it, I'll eat anything. So it depends on how your mentality is. Some people grew up with a vegetable they despise, like broccoli or something, because it was prepared in a way that just made you sick. Like, that's disgusting. It's over steamed mush. Like, when you're growing it, and I know, you know, people try to tell you not to grow things you don't want to eat, but you experience a vegetable you've never eaten before in your life. You want to give these vegetables another try. Trust me, there's things that you don't realize that may have put a bad taste in your mouth literally back in the day that you realize that there's so much more potential with. So just keep an open mind. I mentioned how many zucchini are too many zucchini. Did you all know that there is actually a National Sneak Some Zucchini Onto Your Neighbor's Porch Day? Because if you didn't, there really is on August 8th. So whenever you have too much, just if your neighbor asks why all the zucchini is on his deck, just be like, look, it's National Sneak Some Zucchini on Your Neighbor's Porch Day. And then how much do you want to spend? So if you're doing containers, it can become pricey if you're doing a ton of them because you have to buy the soil. and maybe liquid fertilizer and things like that. So just like I said, start small, kind of understand what your budget needs to be, and then expand out from there. Picking your plants, bush, vine, indeterminate, determinate. You will see indeterminate, determinate a lot. Most of the times you'll see indeterminate. That just means that the plant will produce up until frost kills the plant, basically. Determinate will be, you won't frequently see it, but you may see it on sauce tomatoes like Romas or San Marzanos. This is a plant that will produce one flush of fruit, and that's pretty much it. And they typically ripen around the same time, which is why it's so appealing to sauce makers, because they're getting a load, which they need a lot at once. So indeterminates will be more production, and determinates will be less, but all at once. Seed versus seedling. You will have plants that can be grown from seed directly outside, and you will have plants that if you want a harvest more than just for 1 week, you will need to start them indoors or buy an already started seedling from a nursery. Starting seeds indoors, like versus starting indoors, outdoors rather, I will talk a little bit about some of the vegetables. So tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, the 3 most popular plants that should not be started from seed outdoors, because they have such a long growing period and a ripening period that if you were to start them from seed outdoors, you may only get a very small harvest at the end of the season before things start to slow down and the fall colder temperatures start to come in. Most of everything else can be started from seed, and it's just managing the times when to put them into the ground, which is why you need to pay attention to your seed packets. If you want to start something from a transplant, which a lot of these nurseries and places have transplants or seedlings for almost all the vegetables, the only thing I would recommend you do not start seed indoors or in a container before planting out is something like carrots or parsnips. That is the vegetable is the taproot. So if you damage the taproot, you damage the final product. So those you plant directly into the ground always. Beets, I always thought beets were part of that rule. They're an exception to that rule. You're not eating the taproot on a beet. You can grow beets in containers to start and then transplant them, and they work very well. I've done that several times. So that's an exception. But just bear in mind those 3, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. Those are the 3 popular ones that you want as a seedling when they go into the ground. Just some of the details on the back of a seed packet, whether or not it needs full sun. The depth's important, because if you have a small seed and you plant it too deep, seeds only have so much energy to get the plant up to the point where it reaches the sun, where the sun starts to feed energy to the plant. So if it's too deep, it will come out, it won't have enough energy to get to the surface, and it'll end up dying. If it's too shallow when it's supposed to be deeper, the surface of the soil is the first thing to dry out. So what you can end up having is an issue with the germination taking much longer or not happening at all because it's not staying moist enough at the surface. So just bear in mind of the seed depth. Thinning the plants out, as you can see a picture here, looks like Ed is trimming some of the plants that are right next to each other. If they are larger plants that need a much more, that use a lot of space, or their footprint is wider, you definitely want to pay attention to the thinning out spacing. Things like zucchini get massive. You do not want to grow those right on top of each other if you can avoid it. Tomatoes can have a pretty good footprint. And it's not just about whether or not the plant can absorb the nutrients. It's not whether or not it's going to compete with the other one. It's also because of airflow. Airflow is a huge thing to prevent any type of fungal diseases. You don't want water sitting on areas of the plant, and because there's not enough air circulation, or they're not getting access to sunlight to dry things out. That's when fungal diseases can come in and then start spreading. So spacing for certain plants is very important. just a list here of some of the cool season vegetables. There's others. There's a very large. The cabbage family tends to be very hardy. Kale's in the cabbage family. These are just mostly a lot of the leafy greens and cauliflower, which I didn't mention, but broccoli, etc. Some of the warm seasons, things that, especially when I say peppers and eggplant, you may see them not grow for weeks until the soil warms up enough. If we get a late cold spell or something, they just need a lot of heat. So sometimes what you can do is use those black landscaping fabrics, or they even have a biodegradable black plastic now that basically it helps heat the soil up around the plant. That's very good for peppers and squash, I would say. If you wanted to give them a little boost or to help them thrive faster, you could do something like that. This was the chart I was telling you about. This was from High Mowing Seeds. They're all organic. You'll see all the way to the right here when to plant out, and it's telling you after frost. You'll see this one here, cabbage says 10 weeks before first frost. So like I said, knowing your frost date is very important. Next to that, to the left, it says start transplants, and it's telling you right there when to start your transplants, how many weeks before. Now you can see where it says NA on those. If you look over to the left where it says direct sow or transplant, direct sow means it can go directly in the ground, so you do not need a transplant. So this is all information you can get easily. A lot of the seed vendors, Johnny's has a very good library for giving you different tips on when to grow things, and High Mowing also has great blog information. I mean, there's a ton of information out there now about gardening. It's really a great time to grow between the seed options out there and all the information. Doing some planning. It's obviously best to plan before you just dive out. So keeping notes is good. I use an Excel spreadsheet for a lot of things. It's a good way for me to reference back to years prior. That way I know if something went wrong, I took a note of it. Was there an issue with germination? It's supposed to germinate in 5 days. Why did it germinate in 8 days this time? Did I not give it enough water? What was it? Different things that I can't remember from year to year. So, it's use technology if you can, or a notepad or something. Pete, I don't know did you want to do, I don't know if we're running behind here, but did you want to do a quick gardening planning thing?
Sorry, I must be having a senior moment. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking.
Oh, sorry. So, if you mentioned if you wanted people to get together at some point to discuss.
Yeah, let's go
virtually.
Let's cruise a little longer,
Yeah.
maybe.
Okay.
And then we can do some breakouts and have people kind of articulate. So, like the key takeaways from this brilliant workshop so far.
Chris, there was one question about
Sure.
how to go about getting your soil tested from Cornell Cooperative Extension.
I will. There's I don't have a link to it.
I put a bad link in. I put in the commercial farm.
Link if you search it on. Well, you could also, if you're talking to somebody at Cornell Cooperative Extension, one of the master gardeners there, they will easily get you access to that. But if you go to the Putnam County Cooperative Extension site, you can also search up soil analysis and you'll find it there. I don't have a link to it right now.
Okay,
yeah. Okay. So observing your site. We mentioned here spacing, select a space with a south-facing side on the south-facing side of your property. We get southern exposure up here. So at noon at best, I think in the first day of summer when the sun is, whenever the sun is highest in the sky, I think it's at about a 73, 75 degree angle here, but it's towards the south. So we're always going to get the most sun exposure when you're looking towards the south. as long as there is not a giant structure in front of you casting a shadow. So always, if you can, look for southern exposure, because as the sun rises from east to west in the sky, it's always going to be towards the south a little bit. So you're going to get that exposure, the best sun exposure that way. And it says you can do an east to west orientation. As you can see, that the long ways of the garden is running east-west. That's recommended. It's not necessary. But basically, just keep in mind of the sunlight hours. Because if you know that, and if it's more than 6, 8, then that's really, you're most likely in a south-facing area, but that's just keeping in mind of the sunlight hours. But it's always good to know which way south is. And the reasoning why growing in an individual, in a single bed like this, where you could see the corn all the way to the right, very tall, tomatoes, squash, cabbage. So on the side that the cabbage is, that's the south. On the side that the corn is, that's the north. If it were to be swapped, if the corn was on the area where the cabbage is, that would cast a shadow on the rest of the garden. So that's the reason why, if you have a good amount of spacing between your beds in the garden, it might not cause an issue with each bed next to each other. But in one single bed like this, when plants are closer together, this thing, you have to be very wary of the shadow being casted. So just keep the tall plants on the north side and the shorter plants on the south side. This is just a grid. Best way on Excel, if you have access to Excel, you could kind of use your grids, and each grid could be the equivalent of a square foot, for instance. Very good way to map out your exact space. Different planting. This is a picture of soil blocks. Very cool. If anyone's ever seen those before, it's just another way of kind of growing without having to use any type of plastic containers or anything like that. So if you're very into it, it does require some trial and error to get the recipe right with how much moisture and the right soil. So it takes some patience, but it's a great way to grow. Varieties, whether we want to direct seed, we did go into this a little bit already. Setting out transplants, I will mention one thing. If you're growing your own plants from seed, if you're starting them indoors under artificial light, which, by the way, the best way to start seeds indoors, unfortunately, aside from having a good greenhouse, is with artificial light, because the light exposure we get in the winter or in the very early spring can be so low that it'll cause your transplants to be, your seedlings to be very leggy, very long. And it's not every plant you can reverse that. Tomatoes you can plant as deep as you really want almost, and they'll send roots out along the stem, but a lot of other plants you can't do that with. So barring very good southern exposure on a windowsill or having a greenhouse, artificial light is going to give you the best environment for the healthiest, sturdiest plants before setting out. But when a plant has been growing its entire life indoors under artificial light, it's not used to the UV that the real sun will give it, and it's not used to the wind. So what's called hardening off is a process over a couple of weeks where you slowly introduce your seedling outdoors. It could be a couple hours getting early morning sun or afternoon sun, gradually letting it get more and more sun until you put it out for permanently. So that's just something you want to keep in mind. And I say plant footprint, which I mentioned before. I'll go back to this slide. If this is a 4 by 8 foot bed, it's actually pretty deceiving. I would never grow all of that stuff in that one bed. Take up way too much space. Know the footprint of your plant. A zucchini plant could be 3 feet wide. So like I said, you want to manage the spacing of some things so that you can get a good airflow between your plants. So just know what your mature footprint plant will be when you're putting in those little seedlings that you look like you can put 15 together in one bed, and then, oh my God, they are all growing. and you don't even know what variety you grew because they're like meshed into one little ball in the middle of the, so just be careful of spacing when it comes to larger plants, tomatoes, zucchini. Winter squash versus summer squash. Summer squash is usually on a bush variety or a bush habit. Winter squash is almost always a vine. And when I say a vine, it could be 12 feet long vine. Pumpkins, massive. Just know how much space it's going to take up and plant around accordingly. Different methods of planting. Succession planting, great way to utilize the space and not get inundated with everything at once. If you like one vegetable in particular and you love it, barring you actually going and pickling or canning the vegetables, you're going to get a huge amount of produce in one shot. And you're going to be like, I don't know what to do with all this. And you don't want it to rot, obviously. So doing successions is a good way to get a little at a time, spread out over a longer time. And companion planting, one of the most popular ones for me is just flowers, incorporating flowers around the garden to bring in the pollinators. This is really what it's all about. It doesn't get enough attention. It's finally getting more attention now, but bringing in the pollinators, that support, for me in my garden, the bed in the middle, the bed that's in the center of my garden is a perennial flower garden. That is the heart of the garden. That is where everything, it draws in all the pollinators, and then they work outside of that to pollinate the plants. It's just, I cannot say enough about using flowers around the garden.
Chris,
Yeah.
are there some pollinated? Are there some flowers that are better at attracting pollinators than others?
Sure. I would always go native first if you can. Bee balm is great. It not only pollinators, it brings in hummingbirds. One of my favorites is Anise hyssop. Not only is it an edible, it also draws in a ton of bees, a ton of pollinators, and even the finches love to eat the seeds at the end of the year. You'll see them all over. Goldfinches love hyssop seeds. So it's just one plant that supports so much. So always look, yes, to go native. Allium flowers are beautiful. Those are good for early spring. I'm trying to think else what I have. Catmint, amazing. Loads and loads of bees on that. Golden Alexanders. There's a ton out there. I could go on forever, but those are just some of the really good ones.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So here's just a quick show of some of the intervals you can do with some of the faster growing. Radishes are one of the fastest growing vegetables there is. You can have seed to harvest in as little as 25, 30 days. And if you're doing any baby greens, also very quick. As you get to some of the plants that need a little more time, the intervals, become a little bit further apart. So you'll see some of the plants you can do there. Knowing the days to maturity. So if you have a packet will almost always tell you how many days it will take for the plant to get to maturity. So DTM is used a lot. You'll see an exception for things like when I mentioned peppers, eggplant, and tomatoes. It will be days to maturity from a transplant. So it won't always necessarily say from seed. Those ones will likely say from transplant, but most of the other stuff will be from seed. Improving the soil. Like I said, I cannot say enough about compost. This is a great facility in Danbury that is a very, very mindful person. He loves to do new ingredients all the time, very good into quality. These, we don't have enough of these, basically. We need more compost facilities. But if you don't have the option to do the composting yourself, then of course there's other options out there. So just try to, like, if you can, I always try to buy something local. It's, you know, it's the best way. And I'm sure there's plenty of tips with Sustainable Putnam in terms of trying to keep transportations. Like, the more you buy from somebody that's delivering from California or something, that means that stuff had to be shipped here through a truck, a plane or something. So keeping it local is just support local. I mean, I can't say enough about that. But aside from composting, using mulch, I'm talking organic mulch, grass clippings. As long as you don't treat your grass clippings are valuable to me. I use them all the time, not only as a compost ingredient, but when you're mulching the surface, not too thick. If you do it too thick, you'll cause them to become, basically create a mat between the soil and the surface. So I do like a 2-inch layer, and then once it dries out a little bit and breaks down, I add another. Just use any organic matter that you can to feed back into the soil. It's just free food. It's free fertilizer. Cover crops. I love using cover crops. They're much more popular on the farm scale, but I absolutely love incorporating them in the garden. This is a picture here, one of the coolest cover crops. This is vetch. So with all legumes, they fix atmospheric nitrogen to their roots with, basically it's a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria called rhizobium. And these nodules, you'll see these little nodules, when they turn pink, that is a sign that the plant is basically fixing nitrogen to it. So once the plant is killed or turned into the soil, it's releasing that nitrogen back into the soil. It's actually one of the big reasons why, or probably even the main reason why, there's corn and soy rotations, is because the soybeans are a legume and corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder. So incorporating different types of cover crops not only will add organic matter, but it also can add fertilizer to your soil. And crop rotation, tough to do as a home gardener. I try to do it. Rotating crops from different families is a good way to kind of manage the needs of the soil. If you're always growing a heavy feeder in the same spot repeatedly, it might be harder for those plants to keep up with, or for you to replenish the nutrients for them. Not to mention, if you have a disease of some sort, you want to try to keep growing the same plant over and over in the same spot, because it could end up increasing the amount of disease, or just end up allowing that plant to get the same disease repeatedly. So just, if you can, it's tough, try rotations if you can. I'll just say a couple of words about here. You can find a lot of information about composting on Cornell Cooperative Extension site. The different types of ingredients to use here, lots of stuff that we all have. There's some do's and don'ts you'll see at the bottom. Things that you don't want to use because they can either carry bacteria or bring in a lot of rodents and stuff, that obviously you don't want around the house. So just try to also keep in mind the size of the compost. If you're doing a home compost, I know it can be difficult to get enough, but especially when it's time for leaf cleanup or grass clippings, that's when you can really increase the bulk amount for the compost. So a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot size is recommended so that you're getting the compost, especially for a hot compost. The ingredients are allowing for the compost to heat up enough so that it's killing things like weed seeds and any potential bacteria. You will want to 100% avoid throwing any diseased material, any diseased plants in your compost. We just do not, home composters, we just do not get enough heat in the pile to kill off those things. So it's just a very, very touchy thing to throw in there. So I would just try to avoid throwing those in the compost pile. Just mentioned before about lasagna layers earlier. The whole no-till thing is you know, while we're all, or the no dig, while we're actually still digging to plant plants, it's more of you not disturbing the rest of the soil. Soil creates a structure over time through all the microbes that are feeding through it. There's a lot of things called soil aggregates that are basically like larger clumps of soil that are held together by like secretions from microbes, and they they also hold nutrients as well. So when you're tilling in the soil, what ends up happening is you're feeding oxygen to the soil, causes a massive rush of an increase in the micropopulation, and they break everything down, and then the soil will just settle down even more. So you're damaging all those porous spaces from the worms, all the different, you know, good guys in the soil are kind of being set back. So it's going to take them a long time to build that structure again. So we try not to mess around with the soil if we can. Just gardening maintenance. I mentioned before about fertilizing, about when to do it for certain things. Watering in the ground is obviously different than watering in a pot, but generally the whole 1 inch per week, which is tough to gauge. Speaking of gauges, I use a rain gauge. Great way, simple way to just know how much rain you've gotten throughout a week. You can record it daily. There's an organization called Coco Ross. It's from Colorado University. It is basically a collaborative effort of people throughout the entire country that put in data every day for rainfall, and it goes to their database, and it's a great tool for scientists and stuff to use to know weather patterns and everything. I mean, it's a great cause, and also helps you to know how much rain you've gotten. So, you know, do I need to water, or, you know, if it's been very dry, I'm going to need to water again. So a rain gauge is a very cheap, effective way to know what kind of watering habits you need. Gardening cleanup is important, especially if you have diseased plants. You do not want to leave any debris from a diseased plant around. Some of them can overwinter on dead material. So trying to clean up anything or any, not to mention it also can be a place to hide pests over time. But don't go crazy with the garden cleanup. So there's a big thing now with not leaving everything bare, because we do have pollinators that are native to this area that need a place to stay. So there are things that I will leave behind. I do use leaves, dried leaves, you know, dead leaves after the fall's ended to cover the beds with and stuff like that. But the biggest thing, what I would say with garden cleanup, is just the disease material. That is the big one that you want to pay attention to. And we mentioned rotations, seed saving. The one thing I will mention about seed saving again now is when you are selecting to save seed, you want to save it from the best plant you've grown. You want to replicate the best plant, the one that produced the most vegetable, the most fruit, was the healthiest. When all the other ones got diseased, this one did not. Somehow, something in its genetics, it was able to survive through whatever hit it. So you want to preserve that. So that's when it comes to seed saving. Try to, if you have enough plants, try to be selective. Don't necessarily just grab it from anything. A couple ways to extend the season.
Hey, Chris, before you
Yep.
go there, when you talk about crop rotations, are there certain combinations that complement each other particularly well? So, for example, if I'm growing garlic, is there a good crop that would really bring the supplement that would bring the soil back from the things that the garlic took from the soil?
So there's a lot of talk about different, I don't know how much science is behind it. A lot of talk about this plant loves to be next to this plant, but hates to be next to this plant. I don't really know too much as to how they truly are companions in certain ways. I will say that you can always plan to know how much nutrients one plant may have taken out of the soil, so you know what needs to go back in. So if it's something like a cabbage plant, or like I said, corn before, cabbage family, almost all the cabbage family are heavy nitrogen feeders, then you'll know that nitrogen is. So for instance, if I grew heavy nitrogen plants in a bed, I would grow vetch or a legume that fixes nitrogen in that bed after, so that it's replenishing the nitrogen in the soil. And if I know a bed that has not gotten a ton of nitrogen drawn out of it, I won't put nitrogen fixing plant in that bed, because I don't want to put too much nitrogen. So you can manage that with plants in a way, but I don't normally select certain plants to grow next to each other. but that's definitely open for experimentation because I've heard people who do it.
Thank you.
I have a question about mildew. I have I've gotten flowers that have gotten mildew on them. Is that considered something I should take out and
Like powdery mildew?
yeah?
Yeah, powdery mildew is like one of those, it's like death and taxes. It's always going to be there. It's an unfortunate thing that it's not necessarily, I actually don't think powdery mildew can overwinter. I believe it is one of those things that just starts in one place and kind of spreads. It's very tough to prevent from happening. There are fungicides out there that you can spray. I always avoid spraying. So basically, the best way to manage things like powdery mildew would be to remove the infected leaves so that it doesn't spread to the rest of the plant. And then you could use, I think it's potassium bicarbonate, which is almost like baking soda mixed with water and maybe a little bit of soap, something as a surfactant to keep it to the plant, is also a way to prevent mildews from spreading or killing mildews. But in terms of preventing it from ever happening, it's one of those things that it could be a bad year or it could be a good year. If you get a very humid, rainy week, powdery mildew is just gonna come right in. It just, we're all basically, we're at the will of the gods, so to speak, and it's just whatever the weather decides to do. Unfortunately, that's kind of what we have to deal with sometimes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So just briefly, row covers. These are a great way to not only protect plants in early spring if they've gone in the ground and all of a sudden, whoops, here comes the late frosts. We didn't expect it. You can cover it with remay row covers. There's different kinds, different grades for different temperatures. You'll find them all over the internet. Cold frames, great way to reuse, like a window or something like that to basically create a greenhouse effect almost. And then you want to always have the option to ventilate it. As you see, this one's vented here because it will get too hot as well. That's one way to extend the season on both ends, spring and late fall. So just mentioning before, every vegetable has a family. The parts you eat, root vegetables, you're mainly going towards the roots. Although I will say there's many exceptions to that. You can eat radish greens, very good. Beet greens, very good. Even carrot tops. People make carrot top pesto. So don't necessarily discard everything. I would research it first because there are definitely things you don't want to eat. Like on potatoes, sometimes potatoes will actually make berries or fruit on the top that are green, poisonous. Don't want to eat certain leaves, in the solanaceous family because nightshades can have poisonous parts, but the parts you normally eat are fine. But just research, look into it. There could be something more that you can eat that you didn't realize to use it up, because the alternative is discarding it. And if you don't have a compost, then it's waste. Preparing and eating is up to you. The crop rotation I mentioned before, vegetables all have a family. So knowing the families by researching, you can find out if I wanted to rotate a crop to a different family, just knowing you're not rotating into the same family repeatedly is a good way. If you're into rotating, like I said, it's not 100% needed. Quick vegetable trivia. Does anybody know what family corn is in?
Grass.
Grass?
Yes.
That is correct. It is a grass. It's actually considered, depending on who you ask, it could be a vegetable, a cereal grain, and I guess a grass. So, not that anyone ever references it as a grass, but it is one of those things where you're like, what, a grass? How could that be a grass? So yes, corn is actually a grass. Does anyone know what family sweet potatoes are in? Sweet potatoes are not actually in the potato family. They're not in the solanaceous family. They are in the morning glory family. They're actually more related to bindweed, which we all get, than they are to true potatoes that we normally eat. They're a tropical plant, but very, very good for you. The skin and all on sweet potatoes. But they are very, very long growing. I'll mention that if you want to grow them, they have a long growing period and they need a lot of heat. They are a tropical plant. And they vine. They are a vining vegetable. Different insects. So obviously pollinators are a very important part of it, but there's not just pollinators that are good, because while pollination is a very important part of us getting produce, there's also things that attack our produce that we need help with other than spraying stuff, because spraying should be your last alternative if you can. They also aerate your soil. Worms make tunnels through the soil. They're making pathways for roots, basically. They're allowing water to pass through readily. There's a lot of benefits that they create. We don't see it because they're so small. I'm not exactly sure of the number, but in a teaspoon of soil, I think they say there's billions or trillions of microbes. It's just a very big, vast world that we just do not experience because we can't see it, but it's there. It is very, very much there, and it is very helpful and useful to us. So trying to preserve that is very important. This is a perfect example here. Out of about 1 million known insect species, only 1 to 3% are considered pests. And of course, every bit of that 1 to 3% will be noticeable in your garden because you're growing their food. So that is when we see the pests, when we have their food. So, but just know that not every little insect crawling over your plant is there to destroy it. It could be there to actually inadvertently protect it. So some insects in the veggie garden. Everyone knows ladybugs or lady beetles, but have you ever seen their larvae before on the right? One of the best things, one of the reasons why ladybugs are one of the best insects in your garden is because they're one of the only insects that as a larva and an adult, they eat pests. They eat aphids. They eat whiteflies. They eat a ton of these pests that are all over your plants, and they're voracious eaters. If you pay attention one day on a plant that you might, why is this ladybug on here? There's no flowers, there's no pollen. Look around the plant and see. You might end up finding aphids and be like, wow, the reason why this ladybug is here is because there's a food source for it. So when I say, 1 to 3% of all these insects are pests, but they're almost a necessary pest too in a way, because it creates a balance with nature. So if you killed every single aphid on that plant, then the ladybug wouldn't have food to feed on, right? So you're kind of cutting a food chain for something else. So it's kind of like, just sit back, and if your plant is not being completely destroyed, just watch what happens. You might actually, I guarantee you'll be fascinated, but you might actually witness a balance of nature happening right before your eyes, because I'll have some pictures in here, but I've captured it so many times this past year. And it's just like, wow, like this is happening. They're actually, I don't need to do anything. They're doing it for me. So it's just something cool to really witness. These are some more beneficials on the left. This little emerald looking shiny thing, the long-legged fly, they also eat. You'll see there's a little fly in his mouth. Actually, I was very excited to capture that. And that's, I think, on a milkweed. They're just, these long-legged flies are everywhere. It's great to see them. They're on eggplant all the time. I see them everywhere. Lacewing larvae here, also called the aphid line, because they destroy aphids. They love eating aphids. I think this is a brown lacewing. There's also the green ones, which are more prominent. Really cool thing, I don't have a picture of. They lay their eggs on threads. So if you ever see a little tiny thread with an egg at the end of it, that's from the lacewing laying their eggs. Really cool to see. Hoverflies, they come a lot in the early spring. They're everywhere. Their larvae also eat aphids and other tiny little pests on your plants. Always good to see. They're really cool flying patterns. They like their name suggests, they do that little quick hovering motion around like that. They're pretty cool to see, and their designs on their backs are pretty cool. The braconid here on the right, very important pest control. And you'll see in one of the next slides why they're a very important part in pest control. I'll mention it on the next slide. So this one here, this was the coolest find I've found in years. And this was last year, you know, working from home, able to spend more time in the garden. I was able to capture this. This is a taconid fly on the left, the feather-legged fly. They lay eggs on the squash bugs or the true bug, the stink bug family. Squash bugs can decimate your squash plants. They lay the eggs on the underneath. You'll see a picture later on. That little dot in the middle of that middle picture, that's an egg laid by that taconid fly. This is going to get a little sci-fi, but just listen. That little egg, when the larva hatches, it burrows into that squash bug, and the larva basically takes up the entire inside of that bug, basically feeding on it. And then you'll see on the right, that's where it exited. Not a great way to go, but when you're a home gardener, that's an amazing thing to see, because something that was trying to destroy your plants got taken down by another insect. You don't have to do anything. So really cool thing to see. And this female can lay, I think, up to 100 eggs in its lifetime, this taconid fly. So they could really do a good number on what's around. They won't necessarily eradicate everything, but it is just really cool to witness in your garden. So if you pay close attention, you'll see stuff like this. This is what I was mentioning with the braconid wasp. That is a tobacco hornworm. You see them on your tomato plants all the time. There's also the tomato hornworm. They look similar, but those little white, what look like eggs, are actually cocoons. That, not necessarily the one braconid wasp, but braconid wasp basically laid eggs all over that hornworm. The eggs hatched inside. They basically systematically eat the inside of the worm, the hornworm, the caterpillar, leaving the vital organs intact so that they can basically get out before it dies. They make their cocoons, and then they hatch, and a whole new generation of braconid wasps emerge. And now you have new garden defenders all over the place. If you see a hornworm with these on, I always encourage people to leave it there. Let it stay there. Let them all hatch out and protect your garden. Very cool thing to witness. Again, another way that nature is just balancing things out. I didn't do a thing. Some other things we've all seen: damselflies, dragonflies, bees, of course. The not as common praying mantis, but I've been seeing them more and more lately, which is nice. And of course, spiders. Spiders, don't like them in the house, love them in the garden. Encouraging beneficials, I mentioned before, some flowers that are good. Most flowers are really good. And even some vegetables that flower, your herbs that flower. Mint flowers are a major attractor of insects, especially wasps. And while wasps sound horrific, really only the yellow jacket is one that is a nuisance to you. The rest are very beneficial. So, and I can't say that yellow jackets aren't beneficial too, but they're more likely to be defensive than the other ones. So, basically, like I said, any flower out there that you could find, but some of them I mentioned before, catmint, anise, hyssop, are very big ones. And of course, if you can find native ones, a lot of these plant sales nowadays are getting more and more native. Mountain mint is a great one. So just look out for that. So I'm sure, I mean, I probably had this mentality way back too. I was not a person who really paid attention to insects, and it's just a bug. If it's on my plant, it's probably, I don't want to take the risk. It could be doing something wrong to it. So like, the only good bug is a dead bug. But like I said, just keep an open mind. And some pesticides do not discriminate. There are selective and non-selective pesticides, and some will kill anything it comes in contact with, and some are specifically selected for certain insect families. and I'll mention one. Different types of integrated pest management. You can go the biological route. Some people will actually purchase ladybugs. I don't necessarily recommend it if you don't absolutely have to, because I don't think all of them are wild caught. They're raised in a, inside whatever conditions that they basically to get enough of them, because when they give you a bag of them, there's a lot. But I don't recommend getting ladybugs as a preventative measure, because if a ladybug comes into your garden and finds no aphids, they're gone. They are going to find them somewhere else. So they'll just fly away. Only use it as basically an after the fact, a way to combat something that is already a problem. Mechanical, those are your barriers using row covers, remay, all that stuff, anything that's physically blocking the vegetables from from pests. Chemical, of course, is the pesticides. And then cultural, manipulating the environment. That is you planting a certain vegetable at a different time that's different from the emerging time from a pest. If you're getting really smart on these pests, the squash vine borer, which I'll have a picture of, very big pest of squash plants. If you grow your squash in June, you will avoid major the time basically that they fly around and start laying eggs. So there's different ways that you can manipulate your garden to kind of protect it from certain things. Some low residual pesticides. I won't go too deep into all of them, just to mention that, of course, you want to always read the instructions before using, because they can be harmful, even if organic. Like I said, there's certain compounds that these things are derived from that, although natural, are still harmful to you or your animals. If you have dogs or cats, just read the labels on these, please, because some of them can be harmful to them. BTK, that's basically the only thing I've ever used via spray, and it's a selective. The reason is because it's selective. It does not harm any of the bees or most of the pollinators. It targets the Lepidoptera family, so anything that's a caterpillar. I use this mainly on the cabbage white butterflies larva, the cabbage worm, imported cabbage worm. You will want to be careful, because of course there are great caterpillars out there. There's the black swallowtail caterpillar. There's the monarch caterpillar. The BTK does not, it does not discriminate between different caterpillars. So just be careful not to spray something like this near milkweed or near anything in the carrot family. That's what the black swallowtails feed on: dill, carrots, cilantro, different things like that, parsnip. Just be mindful of where you're spraying, when you're spraying. You could time your spraying to when the pollinators are least active, early morning, or later in the day. Just try to choose wisely when you're using anything that could be harmful to all of the pollinators as well. This is an example of the milkweed aphid. Other aphids will be green. They'll blend in very well. There's all different colors, but this is what an infestation would look like. Excuse me. One way to control aphids is to use a row cover. Just be careful you're not using the row cover after the aphids are there. You don't want to block out a potential way for other insects to get to the aphids if they're already in there. So just be mindful of that. Flea beetles, not necessarily something you need to take action against. I've had them in pretty large numbers. This eggplant right here is probably a picture of my eggplant. They like pepper holes in them. Typically, they don't do more than just cause, an unsightly leaf. But the exception would be, of course, and Pete actually has experienced this, if they go after your cabbage family crops like kale and other things, your leafy vegetables, that would be a different story, I suppose, and you'd probably want to use some sort of a physical block to keep them out, because obviously if you're eating the leaf, you don't want to spray the leaf with something that could be harmful to you. So there's different things to think about, whether or not you want to spray or not, or if you want to use something physical. That's the squash vine borer. On the left is the adult, very difficult to catch. The right is the one that does the damage. So the adult lays eggs on the underneath. They're these little tiny brown eggs. The larva burrows into the stem and basically hollows out the main stem of the plant, which doesn't allow the plant to take up water anymore. And what you'll see is what looks like your entire plant just went limp, as if you hadn't watered it in a week. It just looks like wilted, but there's no amount of watering that'll bring it back to life because it's too late. It's already been hollowed out. And if you cut the stem open, you'll find a bunch of these little guys in there that have been slowly hollowing it out. Cucumber beetles. In infestations, they could be a problem. The one on the left is a spotted cucumber beetle. We get both. The one on the right, which you'll see a lot, is actively producing more cucumber beetles. The striped cucumber could be a vector of bacterial wilt. So that one is a little bit more of an issue than the spotted one on the left. You can see different ways, hand picking, and of course nobody wants to hand pick, but unless you're me. And then there's other options too for sprays, but again, just make sure you read the instructions on those. Potato beetles, that's the 3-line potato beetle on the left, the Colorado beetle on the right. You'll see the 3-line potato beetle on your tomatillos a lot. They love tomatillos, and I say this to people all the time. Guarantee you, when the 3-line potato beetle was first found, it was found on a potato plant, because otherwise it would be called the 3-line tomatillo beetle, because I see them more on tomatillos than I see them on potatoes. Again, handpicked. These are usually in lower numbers, but be careful because they're the adult and the larva will feed on your plants as well. So, and they'll be on the underside typically of the leaf. So check underneath. Colorado potato beetles, same thing. I see less of those though.
Hey, Chris, there's a question.
Yeah.
If insects made holes in kale leaves, like a flea beetle, for example, does that make it inedible?
Nope. It's one of those things where we've been so trained to eat everything that looks perfect, but I guarantee you, I'd rather take a kale leaf that's got a million little holes in it than a perfect leaf that I found on the shelf of the supermarket. So I would encourage you, as long as you're, removing the insects off of it, that you can absolutely 100% still eat it. It's not an issue. This is my nemesis. When I mentioned to you BTK, this is the reason I used BTK. These cabbage white butterflies, which are a pollinator, so it's kind of like their little way of being like, haha, I'm a pollinator, so you shouldn't hurt me. They will lay eggs constantly over and over and over again on your cabbage family crops. And then these little imported cabbage worms, which can be very hard to see, will just start munching away. I have resorted to physical barriers, works very well. BTK, and like all pesticides, the one thing that stinks about using pesticides, especially low residual, is when it rains, there goes your pesticide. You have to reapply it again. So a physical barrier is the way I like to go. I use the row cover. Japanese beetle, who hasn't seen this all over your roses or zinnias or other flowers munching away. There is actually a biological method to removing these. If you've ever heard of milky spore, it is basically a way to remove white grubs from your grass. White grubs are the larvae of the Japanese beetle. They are damaging as a grub because they eat the roots of your grass, and they are very damaging as an adult because they eat the leaves and flowers in your garden. So if you can look into applying milky spore to your lawn, there's different types of year to do it. I think the fall, I can't remember for sure, but that's a way to combat them. The middle one here, that's the squash bug nymphs. Those are the eggs I was talking about from that large adult before. This is very easy to remove by hand. That's how I do it. I check under the leaves, I'll remove them by hand. And then of course, if you have that tachinid fly on your side, they'll also kind of help you out a little bit, but they won't necessarily control all the numbers. So I recommend working in tandem. And if you find one that has an egg on it, then I like to leave those so that it can finish doing its job. I don't want to kill the tacitus fly larva inside. Tortoise beetle larva on the right, alien looking thing. It's got a very disgusting method that on its back there, it will eventually have a shell, which makes it look like a tortoise, which is why it's called the tortoise beetle. That on its back there is a shield made of basically fecal matter. It's way to defend itself from its enemies, and it will raise the shield up if it gets harmed. They're not usually a major issue. I find them on solanaceous crops, tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes a lot, but aside from hand picking, they don't cause enough damage to kill the plant. Okay, so just another little tip before we close up soon. This was a tip that I was given when I first started with the Master Gardeners. If you type in site:/edu after your search, it will give you very reputable sources, universities that have information, not necessarily taking you to a blog of somebody who thinks they know everything. Sometimes bad information out there spreads like wildfire, and I've seen it plenty of times. So just when you're looking for sources, try typing in site:/edu at the end of your search, and it will bring you right to either somebody like Cornell or another university that has done extensive research on the topic. So I use this every day, all the time. And I think just wanted to show you some seed vendors, mostly out of New York. These are a lot of great places that I order from all the time. My favorite one is probably High Mowing, although I'm trying to get into fruition a little bit more. They have a ton of organic seed, and if High Mowing seeds, I think if you spend over $20 or $25, it's free shipping, which is very good for seed vendor sites. That's when it comes to other sites like Johnny Selected Seeds, very expensive seed, very high quality seed. Their seed is very difficult to beat for quality, but you're going to pay for it, and they don't really give you much for deals. Hudson Valley Seed, I don't know if everyone knows, they're famous for their art on their packets, beautiful art, and they're local. So that's another one. And then Seed Savers Exchanges are great because they preserve a lot of the varieties out there that are older or in danger. And there's a huge collaborative effort there between a lot of people that do seed saving. So that's a good one. And then just a couple pictures I've taken over to give you some inspiration. On the left there, that's the center of a poppy flower from a mix I've planted. Bachelor's button, I mean, come on, look at that. Is that even real? That's right before it opens up. The sunflower. Carter bees, very cool. They love the mint family. Black swallowtails, like I mentioned, you'll see them a lot. They may end up becoming a pest to you if they're decimating your parsley and dill. But if you grow enough, I just recommend moving them to another plant of some sort because they're a beautiful butterfly, and they also are a pollinator. And of course, if you've got some good shade under your plants, it'll draw in other things like the local cat.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, there's a question around buying seed packets from the store versus going to one of these seed companies, like what the difference might be.
You mean like
Going to Home Depot or to like Lowe's or something and getting seed there.
I don't necessarily discourage anybody from doing it. I mean, you're out, it's there. I tend to gravitate more towards these companies because they're more local, they're smaller businesses than the businesses like Burpee, and they're very, very mindful of the varieties that they're choosing and stuff like that. And the good thing too is you're choosing varieties that are grown. They're not always grown because these seed vendors don't always grow out and save the seed. They sometimes will buy it from other vendors. but they tend to grow varieties that are northern varieties. So stuff that we are able to grow, that are better for our area. Plus nowadays you spend enough, it's free shipping. If you order online, you're going to have a much wider variety to choose from than in person. You can get some really long lost varieties out there. Hundreds of different tomato varieties, hundreds of different lettuce varieties, just difficult to find on the shelf.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also, I just want to mention, because it's not just pollinators, rabbits obviously can cause issues in your garden, but they absolutely love clover. They love to graze on clover. You should always incorporate a little clover in your grass anyway, because as I mentioned before, it's a nitrogen fixator. So it is a great mix. Not to mention it, they flower all over the place. Bees love. I'm sure everyone's heard of clover honey. But these cute little furry guys will probably be less likely to chew on your vegetables if they have clover to graze on. So clover is great to have. I mentioned before, goldfinches love eating hyssop seeds. And I haven't seen as many hummingbirds as I have this year because I grew scarlet runner bean. They are obsessed with scarlet runner bean flowers, the hummingbirds. It's a good thing to put in the garden.
Chris, thank you very much. I have some clover in my lawn, which I started from seed years and years ago. I got it at a local nursery. I have not been able to find it. Okay, I guess I could probably find it from one of those seed companies you mentioned.
Yeah, actually, several seed companies now, they sell cover crop seed, and that is actually under cover crops because clover is sometimes used as a living mulch in some farms. So you could find white clover, which I think is the common one, or like Dutch clover. It's a lower growing, and it's either a perennial or or like every 2 years, but it readily reseeds itself too. But yes, you could definitely find those on. I would check High Mowing Seeds, or there's a number of places that will sell it. But yeah, you could definitely find it.
Cool.
I guess we have some time here if you want questions.
So I guess that's what I was thinking I would do. So just kind of opening it up to anybody who has any questions or kind of want to bounce something off of Chris as a sounding board, convenient master gardening sounding board while we have him. And just kind of I think we have a small enough crowd that you can be kind of spontaneous about it. So just turn yourself off mute and jump on in if you got a question.
I have a question about violets. I have lots of violets in my garden, on my lawn. What lawn?
Purple?
Yeah.
That is, I believe, if it's the violet I'm thinking of, it is a native. And there is, and it's escaping me right now, there is a butterfly that's their host plant. And it's a very beautiful butterfly. Is it the fritillary? It could be the great fritillary. I couldn't find them. I found like one in my yard, and I started transplanting them to an area that it wasn't getting mowed, so that I could have it for the butterflies to use as a host plant. So I guess it's up to you, but those violets are native to the area, so that's it's a good thing to have, actually.
Oh. Hello. Hi.
Hello?
Yes. I just wanted to check about raised beds. How early do you think I can start putting in vegetables? The raised bed is probably 2.5, 3 feet off the ground. And it has a bottom to it. And peas, how early? I've planted them at different times. I heard St. Patty's Day is the time for peas, but the weather's so crazy.
Right. And that is, again, like one of those things where you have to, so the instructions usually for things like peas is when the soil is workable, but that's not always what you should go by. So the soil could be workable, but the soil could be soaking wet. If you plant peas into a wet, cold soil, you have a very high risk of them rotting. So you want the soil to drain a little bit and dry out a little bit and warm up a little bit before. So if the soil is workable and it's not too wet, then I suppose I'd probably wait till, I don't know about St. Patty's Day, maybe a week later, but just see what the conditions are like, because you can always plant more seeds too. So if you want to do like a succession planting, like I mentioned, that could be a good way to get better germination.
Okay. I have kale, a little bit of kale anyway, that wintered over.
Yeah.
And I've had leeks winter over in the past. So how early can you do those two crops?
Leeks, I usually do. When do I do leeks? I want to say I do leeks in May or June, but I only do that because I start them for a fall crop. For a spring crop, I wouldn't be sure, but you'd have to start them early. All the allium family, if you're starting them from seed, the allium family has like a 10 to 12 week growing period before set out. I normally start them in February from seed if I'm doing it. But if you're going to grow them for a fall crop, which you can do, and they will overwinter like you've experienced, I would probably start them soon. You could probably start them now, actually. Indoors, if you're doing them indoors. Do you start from indoors?
No, most of the time, because I have quite heavy soil. It's a lot of clay in it.
Okay.
And even with over the years having composted and all that stuff, I find that I do better with the plants.
Oh, okay. So you've bought them from.
Yeah, I do.
So I would say April for the leek seedlings.
Okay.
Great. And
As a question.
Jennifer, Jennifer had a question.
Oh yeah, I have last year I have lots of fruit bushes and trees. I have raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, peaches, and I seem to have fed the entire neighborhood of animals with these things. So I have chipmunks that ate all my strawberries, the birds ate all my blueberries, all of them. When I say all of them, like I have tons of plants and literally like a handful I got. What is the best way to deal with this? Especially the chipmunks. The chipmunks killed me this year. And they're just, I saw like 6 of them. Like they all have names now because we've been home. So we know everybody.
Alvin?
Yeah, pretty much.
It's tough. And yeah, of course, sometimes you're okay with giving those animals some of your produce, but you don't want to take it all. But netting is really the way to go. I've used netting for my blueberries and pots. It's just a way to keep things from getting to the berry. I mean, you can't always necessarily put it directly on the plant because then they can get it through the netting if it's small enough, like a blueberry.
Right. So you have to build like a frame around it. Like, I mean, I don't want to be.
Right.
It's a lot of plants.
You could easily, they sell, I bought 100-pack on a grower supply site. They sell these like wire pieces that you bend into rings.
Oh, okay.
You just bend them over in a row and then throw the netting over and then secure the netting along the sides. I can't guarantee you that a chipmunk's not going to burrow underneath and grab, but it's something that'll keep at least birds away from.
Okay, because like the strawberries, they're all on the ground,
Right.
I have like a rock bordering it. I'm just wondering what the best way, because obviously you want it pollinated too, so you don't want the netting so that,
Right. I mean, you could leave the netting off when they're flowering, and then, it takes some time for the strawberries to go from flower to a ripened strawberry. So
right.
Once you've noticed that there's green strawberries on there, I'd say then you could throw the netting on.
Okay. And do you recommend like the bigger hold black netting or like the white mesh, like smaller hold?
Well, actually, if you want to keep everything out, you can use a row cover to keep even insects out, which is like a mesh. Or for things like blueberries and even strawberries, I've used the like 1/4-inch netting. As long as it's not on top of the plant, it's a little elevated. Yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
great, thank you.
Chris?
Yes.
Hi.
Hey, I recognize you.
Yeah, hi. Very enjoyable. I was thrilled that you were going to be doing a presentation like this. So last year, I had success with tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, and yellow beans. And that means that I did have the pollinators. I could see the bees systematically going from yellow bean plant to plant right down the row. However, the zucchini and the yellow squash, they were producing beautiful flowers. And, I thought it was hard to not have a good zucchini crop, but last year I got very few zucchinis and not really an edible yellow squash. Any ideas on that?
Can you tell me what were they not pollinated at all? Were they just falling off at a young size, or?
Well, because the bees were doing their job on the other kind of vegetables, I just assumed that they would work on the zucchini and the yellow squash. The flowers were beautiful for a few days. They were not falling off quickly. From that standpoint, I should have, if I knew that was going to happen, that they weren't going to, produce fruit, I should have done that thing of grabbing the flowers and, doing the coating with the dough, making the fritter things.
Oh. I was going to say, if it's fried flowers, I would say if you think it was a pollination issue, you can certainly hand pollinate. When it comes to winter, to squash in general, they're the easiest, I would say, to hand pollinate because the flowers are so big. You can easily get the pollen out and then add it to the female flower. If you think it was pollination, I would be shocked if it was, because you're saying you saw bees around everything else.
Sure, yeah. I wondered if maybe in your travels from last season, like there was one year when cucumbers didn't grow very well for people, but I had a good year with them. So I wondered if maybe you heard anything like what I'm saying about the zucchinis from someone else.
No, I don't think. I know what you mean, though. There are good and bad years for every vegetable. One year will be exception. One year will be terrible. I guess it's just the weather. I have not heard anything about squash, so I'm perplexed as to how that would have happened.
All right.
Anybody else?
Okay.
Yeah, now you can speak.
I heard from another gardener that it's a possibility that I guess the beetle or the whatever attacks the squash gets into the ground. And if you have trouble 2 seasons in a row, that the best thing is to move to another location. Have you heard anything about that?
Beetle that attacks the plant?
Yeah, but
I know the vine borer, that's a very big pest of the plant, overwinters in the soil from where the host plant, so it'll burrow and it'll overwinter. But if the issues, I suppose, that you had with your plant is that if the plants didn't just die and wilt, it wouldn't have been the vine borer. I don't know what I mean. Squash bugs are a pest, but you'll see the damage noticeably on the leaves. It seemed to me like there was some sort of like a, it wasn't necessarily a pest more than it was something like physiological with the plant. But there's certainly reasons why, yes, you should rotate because of building up a pest in the soil. But as home gardeners, the only thing that's a pain is if the pests can fly, they're going to find you no matter what. So we just don't have a large enough space to separate rotation. So
yeah. Have you had success with vertical?
Of which? Of any vegetable or?
And yeah, any.
Yes. Yes, cucumbers, I recommend, just because if you can keep the fruit off the soil, less likely to be attacked by certain ground pests and less likely to rot. Um, I That's probably the biggest one for me is cucumbers in terms of vertical. You can do other things if you have a small enough winter squash. I've done honey nut butter squash on a vertical grow before. You can do melons as long as you have a very sturdy support, and you can use a sling of some sort to hold the fruit so that it doesn't fall off.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm hoping that you come back.
I'm
Well-
always around. So through the cooperative extension, there's plenty of ways to get good resources. So yes.
Great.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the presentation and all your responses to our questions. Again, we've recorded this, so we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel, and I believe the Cooperative Extension will be as well. And hope everybody will check out Sustainable Putnam and consider joining, and if you're able to perhaps give us a little donation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Nice job, brother.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
Take good care.